I knew something was wrong the moment the silence stretched longer than it ever had before. My son Aaron always called me. Maybe it was once a week, sometimes more if work wasn't too heavy. But it was steady, like the ticking of a clock. A rhythm that anchored me after my husband passed away. So when the phone stopped ringing for days, then weeks, I felt it deep in my bones. People around me said he was probably just busy, but a mother knows. There is a different kind of silence that carries weight, the kind that presses on your chest and steals the air. I tried to distract myself with my books and my quiet routines, but every unanswered call felt like a door closing. Every time his voicemail clicked on, my heart sank a little lower. At night, I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying old conversations in my head, clinging to the sound of his voice. And then came the 10th day, when even my grandson Leo's cheerful chatter was missing from the background of those calls that never came. That was the breaking point. I packed a bag without even thinking, folded clothes with trembling hands, and bought a ticket for the next bus to Cleveland. The ride felt endless, each mile pulling me closer to a truth I wasn't ready to face. Outside the window, winter fields blurred into gray, and the hum of the engine only fed the knot in my stomach. I kept remembering Aaron's laugh, Leo's little stories about school projects, and how that thread of connection had never once snapped before. Until now. By the time I stepped off the bus, the evening air cut through my coat like ice. Aaron's townhouse stood familiar yet strange in the fading light. The kind of quiet that doesn't comfort but unsettles. My shoes crunched against the frozen ground as I climbed the front steps. I knocked, called his name, tried to believe I would hear him answer. Nothing. When I wrapped my fingers around the doorknob, I expected resistance. Aaron was careful, always locking up, especially with Leo inside. But the knob turned easily. The door gave way. In that instant, my breath caught. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. And that was the moment I stepped across the threshold into the beginning of the nightmare waiting inside. The moment I stepped inside Aaron's house, the air felt heavier than it should have. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed chaos and fear. My eyes swept across the living room, and my heart sank. The sofa was pushed halfway into the center of the room, as though it had been shoved aside in a hurry. A coffee mug lay shattered on the floor, its porcelain shards glittering under the dim light. Dark stains bled into the carpet, spreading like shadows that refused to fade. I felt the tremor in my chest tighten, because I knew those stains were not just spilled coffee. I moved slowly, every step deliberate, as if the silence might shatter with too much noise. My voice caught in my throat when I whispered Aaron's name into the emptiness. No answer came back, only the hollow creak of the house beneath my feet. My hands shook as I steadied myself on the banister and climbed the stairs. Each step felt heavier, as though my body already knew what my heart wasn't ready to face. Upstairs, room after room greeted me with silence. The bedspreads were untouched, the closets eerily neat. But when I reached Leo's bedroom, I stopped cold. The air was different here, thicker, suffocating. Then I heard it, a faint scraping sound, steady but weak, like something trying to exist unnoticed. My body froze, torn between fear and the desperate need to protect. I lowered myself, knees trembling, and peered beneath the bed. That was when I saw him. My grandson, Leo. He was curled up into himself, his tiny frame thinner than I remembered, his cheeks sunken, his little hands clutched an empty plastic bottle as though it were his lifeline. His eyes, those wide, beautiful eyes, stared right through me, vacant, unblinking, as if the world had gone somewhere he couldn't follow. My heart broke in that instant. I wanted to pull him into my arms, to tell him he was safe, but my hands shook too badly. My breath came uneven, and I forced myself to back away just long enough to dial the police with trembling fingers. The minutes stretched like hours until the red and blue lights finally washed across the windows. 2 officers rushed in, their voices firm yet careful as they followed me upstairs. One of them knelt, speaking softly, coaxing the silence. When they lifted the bed frame, Leo didn't move. He just stayed curled in his fragile world until the officer gently scooped him up. I stumbled behind them as they carried him out into the bitter night. The siren wailed, piercing the quiet street, and I whispered through my tears, begging him to hold on. That was how we left the house, him in their arms, me trailing close behind, stepping straight into the unknown that awaited at the hospital. The hospital swallowed us in a blur of white lights and rushing footsteps. I trailed behind the stretcher, clutching my coat so tightly my knuckles ached. Nurses and doctors surrounded Leo, their movements quick but precise. I caught fragments of their words: dehydration, severe malnutrition, trauma, and each one landed like a stone in my chest. My grandson's little body lay so still under the harsh glare, an IV snaking into his fragile arm. He didn't look like the boy who used to chatter endlessly about school projects and Lego towers. He looked lost, drifting somewhere far away. I stood at the doorway, unable to breathe, my heart screaming to reach for him while my feet remained frozen. It was agony to watch strangers fight for his survival, while all I could do was whisper his name under my breath. That sound, my own voice breaking, felt like the only thread left tethering me to hope. As the hours stretched on, I found myself sitting by his bedside, stroking his small hand, remembering how this wasn't the first time silence had unsettled me. When my husband died, Aaron had made it his duty to call me at least once a week. Sometimes just a quick update about work. Sometimes a funny story about Leo. Those calls weren't just chatter. They were lifelines, steady beats reminding me that I wasn't alone in the world. And now, here I was, staring at the stillness of his child, realizing how cruelly fragile those threads could be. On the 3rd night, my phone buzzed, startling me out of my daze. The detective's voice carried a weight I wasn't ready to hear. He explained that they had tested Aaron's townhouse with luminol. Under the glow, they found blood, more than just a trace. My body went cold, my lips struggling to form any response. It was no longer a question of worry. Something terrible had happened. I hung up and sat there in the sterile light, the weight of that knowledge pressing down like a stone. That was when Leo stirred. His small fingers tugged weakly at my sleeve, and for the first time in days, sound escaped him. His voice was raw, trembling, but unmistakable. He cried out that his daddy was gone. The words sliced through the room, shattering the fragile quiet. And in that moment, grief and dread twisted together. leaving me to wonder what darkness my family had truly fallen into. I still remember the first time Aaron brought Sabrina home. She was young, soft-spoken, with a shy smile that made me believe she was someone who would cherish him. She seemed eager to fit in, helping with the dishes, laughing nervously at my questions about her cooking. Back then, I thought my son had found a partner who would stand beside him for life. For a little while, it even felt true. They married, and when Leo was born, our family was wrapped in a new kind of light. But that light dimmed faster than I ever expected. Sabrina began changing, and at first, it was subtle. Little hints of late nights, excuses about being out with friends, money disappearing without explanation. Then I learned about the gambling. Small bets at first, the kind she brushed off with a smile. But it grew into something darker. Soon, there were phone calls at odd hours, collectors showing up at their door, and debts piling higher than Aaron could keep up with. My son tried so hard to carry the weight. He sold the car he'd been so proud of, the one he'd saved for years to buy, just to cover one of her debts. He came to me once, his eyes red, asking for help. I gave him what I had, convincing myself it would only be this one time. But the cycle didn't stop. The shouting in their house grew louder, and Leo, just a little boy, was often caught in the middle. I remember one visit Sabrina berating him harshly for spilling a glass of milk, her voice sharp and merciless, while Aaron stood by, helpless. That image is burned into me, because in that moment, I saw not just my grandson's tears, but my son's heartbreak. When the divorce finally came, I thought relief would follow. Aaron won custody of Leo, and for a time, there was peace again. He poured himself into being a father, steady and present, determined to protect his child from the storms Sabrina had left behind. But even then, the past had left its mark. Aaron had taken out a life insurance policy years before, after Leo was born. I remember how proud he was when he showed it to me, saying he wanted to make sure his family would always be secure. What he never realized was that he had left Sabrina as the sole beneficiary. He never changed it after the divorce. Out of love and responsibility, he had unknowingly left a door open, one that greed could walk straight through. At first, Leo barely spoke. In the hospital, his eyes were fixed somewhere far away, and I wondered if I would ever hear his voice again. I sat by his bed for hours, whispering gentle reassurances, praying that my presence might pull him back. Then, one night, as the machines hummed softly and the nurse's footsteps echoed in the hallway, he tugged at my sleeve. His lips parted, and a faint whisper broke the silence. He told me his daddy had hidden him under the bed. His words were halting, broken by pauses so long I thought he might stop altogether. But then, with trembling breaths, he continued. He remembered Aaron lifting him gently, tucking him into the narrow, dark space, and telling him to stay quiet, no matter what happened. Leo said he was scared of the shadows, but he could still see the edge of the living room from where he lay. His small voice faltered as he described Sabrina. She wasn't alone. There was a man with her, a tall figure whose presence filled the room with menace. The argument grew louder, angrier, until Leo's tiny hands pressed against his ears. Still, he saw enough. He saw his daddy standing firm, protecting him, refusing to back down. And then came the moment that shattered everything. Leo said the man shoved Aaron hard, so hard that his head struck the corner of the table. The sound echoed in the boy's memory sharp, final, unforgettable. My chest tightened as he recounted it, his words trembling, his eyes filling with tears he could barely understand. He told me he heard something heavy being dragged across the floor. He stayed frozen under the bed, clutching his bottle, too afraid to breathe, while Sabrina's voice cut through the room. He didn't repeat her words, maybe he couldn't, but I could hear the hatred in his tone as he remembered the way she looked at Aaron. Listening to my grandson relive that night was unbearable. Every instinct in me screamed to shield him, to protect his innocence, but I knew I couldn't close my ears to the truth. His hesitant confession was the piece we had been dreading. Aaron was gone, not by accident, but by betrayal. And Sabrina had been part of it. As Leo's voice trailed into silence, I held him close, my tears falling into his hair. The weight of his words crushed me, yet I knew this was only the beginning. The truth was out, and now the trail of greed and betrayal had to be followed. When the detectives returned to me after speaking with Leo, their faces carried the heavy weight of confirmation. Piece by piece, they began laying out what they had found, and I listened with a heart that clenched tighter with every word. Neighbors came forward first. One woman across the street admitted that on that stormy night, she heard shouting and the crash of furniture, but fear kept her from calling the police. Another remembered seeing shadows moving through the flickering light of Aaron's windows. Their voices trembled as they spoke. But even their fear was not enough to soften the reality of what had happened inside my son's home. Then came the footage. The detectives showed me a grainy recording from a neighbor's security camera. The storm blurred much of the image, but one detail stood clear: a dark pickup truck parked outside Aaron's townhouse. Minutes later, it pulled away. Something long and heavy hidden beneath a tarp in the back. I felt sick as I imagined what that weight must have been. But the most devastating piece came not from the neighbors or the footage, but from Aaron himself, something he had done years before. Out of love, without knowing how it might one day be twisted. The detectives placed a folder in front of me. Inside was Aaron's life insurance policy. I remembered the day he first showed it to me. He had smiled with that earnest, boyish pride, telling me he wanted to make sure his family would always be secure no matter what. At the time, I had been touched by his thoughtfulness. It was one of those moments when I looked at him and thought, he truly is a good man, a responsible father. But there it was, in black and white. The sole beneficiary was Sabrina. Even after the divorce, he had never changed it. Out of a sense of duty, or maybe out of a naive hope that she might still one day choose what was right. He had left the door open, and now it had given her motive. His love had become her weapon. As I stared at that policy, my chest tightened with a mix of sorrow and rage. Aaron had sacrificed everything to protect his son, and in the end, the one person he had once trusted most used his devotion as an excuse for betrayal. The detectives assured me they were closing in. The testimony, the footage, the policy, it was all forming a trail, one that led directly to Sabrina. And though the thought of what was to come filled me with dread, it also carried a grim certainty she could no longer hide. Soon, there would be nowhere left for her to run. When the detectives finally told me they had tracked Sabrina down, I felt my breath catch in my chest. She had been hiding in an abandoned house at the edge of the city, a place as cold and hollow as her choices. Alongside her was the man Leo had described, the tall figure who shoved my son and helped drag his body away. There was a grim relief in knowing they were found, but it did nothing to soften the ache of what had already been stolen from us. The days leading up to the trial were a blur of interviews and preparations. Every time the phone rang, my stomach clenched. I was called into meetings with the prosecution, where they explained how the evidence would be presented. Grainy footage of the truck, the stained blanket, the insurance documents, it all formed a case that was damning and undeniable. And yet, even with the strength of it all, I feared the system might somehow let her slip through its cracks. When the trial began, I walked into the courthouse holding Leo's small hand. He trembled, but I squeezed gently to remind him he wasn't alone. Reporters lined the steps, cameras flashing, voices calling out, but all I could hear was the echo of Aaron's laughter in my memory. Inside, the air was heavy, every seat filled, every eye fixed on the front where Sabrina sat in handcuffs. She tried to look composed, but there was a sharpness in her eyes, a twitch in her hands that betrayed the mask. The prosecution began with the evidence. They laid out photographs of Aaron's townhouse, the marks on the floor where furniture had been shoved, the blankets soaked with blood. Then they played the blurry video of the pickup truck idling outside. I could feel the room tighten with each piece, the truth pressing down on everyone present. But the moment that silenced even the shuffling of papers was Leo's testimony. They did not make him take the stand. He was too young, too fragile. Instead, his voice filled the courtroom through a recording. I listened as his small, halting words described that night, how his father told him to hide, how he peeked through the comforter, how he heard the crack when Aaron's head struck the table. My chest burned as I watched jurors wipe their eyes, as I held Leo close and prayed he would never again have to carry such a burden out loud. And then, just when the evidence seemed overwhelming, Sabrina snapped. She rose suddenly, her voice sharp and trembling, insisting she never meant to kill him, that she only wanted the money. The room froze. Her own accomplice, sitting beside his lawyer, turned on her in an instant. His words tumbled out, describing how she had planned it all, how she promised him payment once the insurance came through. The judge's gavel struck, trying to restore order, but the damage was done. Her own rage had betrayed her. When the verdict finally came, I felt time slow. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of insurance fraud. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her accomplice received 20 years for aiding her. The words echoed through the courtroom, final and unchangeable. I sat there holding Leo's hand, my tears falling silently. Justice had spoken, but it was not victory. Nothing would bring Aaron back. The grief remained, heavy and unrelenting. Yet beneath it all, there was a thin thread of relief, a fragile sense that at least the truth had been laid bare, that my grandson and I could begin to step forward without shadows chasing us. As we left the courthouse, the cameras flashed again, reporters shouted questions, but I had nothing to say. I simply walked away with Leo at my side, carrying both the weight of loss and the faint, bittersweet comfort of justice served. And deep down, I knew the hardest part was still to come, the slow, quiet work of rebuilding a life in the aftermath of so much ruin. That would be the next chapter of our story. When the trial ended and the heavy doors of that courtroom finally closed behind us, I knew nothing would ever feel the same again. Yet life has a way of urging us forward, even when our hearts are still tethered to loss. I brought Leo back with me to the quiet town where I grew up, a place where the streets are narrow, the houses lean close together, and neighbors still wave from their porches as you pass. It felt like stepping into a slower rhythm, one that I hoped might cradle us while our wounds were still raw. The first mornings, they were the hardest. I would wake up expecting the silence to crush me, as it had so many nights in Cleveland. But instead, I heard the hum of lawnmowers, the faint chatter of children walking to school, and the smell of coffee brewing from the corner cafe. That steadiness, the ordinariness of it, wrapped around me like a soft blanket. Neighbors came with casseroles, with warm bread, with offers to help paint the spare room for Leo. I saw in their eyes a quiet understanding. They knew we were fragile, and they held us gently. Still, when the sun slipped down behind the church steeple, the grief returned. I'd sit on the porch swing, watching Leo draw shapes in the dirt with a stick, and I'd ache for Aaron to be there. He should have been watching his boy grow, not buried under the weight of someone else's greed. But then, slowly, the small routines began to save us. We cooked dinner together, nothing fancy, just pasta with too much cheese or scrambled eggs when neither of us had the energy. I read him bedtime stories, my voice trembling at first, but growing steadier as his eyelids grew heavy. He began leaving drawings on the fridge houses, trees, a stick figure with messy hair holding the hand of a smaller one. Us. We started walking every evening, just before dark. The air would cool, the cicadas buzzing in the fields, and Leo would reach for my hand without saying a word. In those moments, I felt the weight shift, as though the grief was still there, but no longer steering every step. I won't pretend I don't cry for Aaron. I do sometimes when Leo is asleep. Sometimes when I find an old photograph tucked in a book. But now, when I cry, it isn't only from despair. It's from love, from the reminder of how much he gave to us, and how much I must carry forward for his son. Life has not given us back what was stolen. It never could. But in this little town, in the laughter of a child who is slowly healing, I have found pieces of peace, and I hold on to them fiercely. If you're listening now, I hope you remember this even after the darkest storms. There can be mornings where the air feels lighter. Healing is not forgetting. It is holding on to love so tightly that it teaches you how to live again. If this story touched you, share it. Speak about it. Let it remind you that resilience is built in the smallest acts of care, and never underestimate how love, quiet, stubborn, everyday love can carry us through even the deepest loss.